The laughter in the courtroom wasn't loud. It didn't need to be loud. It was sharp, like the dry crack of a whip against the air. It began in the back row, where men in three-piece suits sat. Leaning back, their leather shoes gleaming, their gold watches flashing under the cold fluorescent lights. Then it spread, slowly, deliberately, until even the policeman guarding the door turned away, feigning a cough to hide a sarcastic smile. They were laughing at Arthur Bishop, an 82-year-old black man, standing alone before the dock, in a faded, worn coat, his wrists trembling slightly from age and the deep-seated pain of arthritis. He didn't look like someone standing before a court. He looked like someone who had wandered into a place where he didn't belong. To them, he was just an obstacle, a minor obstacle on the road to a multi-million-dollar project, a new shopping mall, a luxury complex, a step forward for the community. And Arthur Bishop? Just something to be cleared away. No one in that room saw him as a man of history. No one asked how long he had lived on that land. No one cared why he was still there. They only saw a poor, old man, black, no lawyer, no power. And they were certain this trial would end quickly. Arthur stood still. He didn't turn to look at the crowd behind him. He was all too familiar with that kind of laughter. He'd heard it his whole life. In the shops where people watched his every move. In the offices where people talked past him as if he didn't exist. And now, in the courtroom, where justice should have been the only thing on the table. The air in the courtroom smelled of polished wood, old paper, and something heavier than anything else. The smell of long-standing power. Arthur gripped the edge of the dark wooden table before him. His knuckles were white, not from fear, but from pain. The familiar pain of old age, a throbbing ache whenever rain was imminent in the Georgian mountains. A pain that reminded him his body had endured too many years. To his left was an empty chair. That was where his lawyer should have sat. But no one was there. Arthur's assigned public defender had called in sick just hours before the trial. A perfect coincidence, especially when looking across the room. Arthur didn't have the money to hire a private lawyer. He had sold his old truck to pay the filing fees. He had scraped together every penny of his meager pension to pursue this lawsuit. But when the most crucial moment arrived, he stood here alone, across the narrow aisle where the men Arthur silently called predators. Between them was Preston Sterling, 45 years old, his skin tanned from skiing and golf holidays. His suit cost more than the car Arthur had driven here. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, twirling a gold-plated pen between his fingers. He glanced at Arthur, then smiled. Not a mocking smile, but the smile of someone certain of victory. Beside Sterling was Gavin Pierce, the firm's chief counsel, a man with a thin smile and eyes as cold as a shark. It was said that Pierce hadn't lost a land case in the past 10 years. They weren't here to argue. They were here to finish. Stand up. The voice of the judicial officer rang out, monotonous and weary. Judge Lawrence Thorne entered the courtroom, a man of the system, his face etched with the wrinkles of lavish dinners and easy verdicts. He glanced at the file, then looked down at Arthur. His gaze lingered on the worn coat, on the mismatched buttons, on the worn heels of his shoes. A fleeting glance, but enough to determine Arthur's place in this room. Sit down, the judge said, his voice dry. The gavel tapped lightly. As a warning, Arthur Bishop took a deep breath. He didn't know that in just a few minutes, the very room that was laughing at him would no longer have anyone who dared to laugh. Arthur Bishop remained standing as everyone in the courtroom sat down. He needed a few more seconds for his knees to stop trembling. No one was waiting for him. Here, weakness was not tolerated. Finally, Arthur sat down in the hard wooden chair at the defendant's table. The chair creaked softly, as if it too were too worn out. For the day, to his left, was still the empty chair. No leather briefcase. No reassuring whisper. No one to lean down and say, "Don't worry, I'm here." Arthur glanced at the chair one more time, as if to make sure it was truly empty. Then he turned away. 40 years ago, he had learned a lesson in the military. When no one is guarding your left flank, it's best not to stare at that empty space for too long. Case 492B, Judge Thorne said, his voice even, like he was reading a shopping list. Sterling Horizons versus Arthur Bishop. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing at the file. Then he looked up. "Mr. Bishop, the file shows you still do not have a lawyer." Arthur rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse like dry leaves scraping against the pavement. My lawyer is not here. A brief silence. Not a silence of sympathy, but a silence of inconvenience. The judge frowned. We've postponed this hearing 3 times already, Mr. Bishop. Arthur swallowed hard. Your lawyer, Mr. Doyle, is the one you insisted on choosing, the judge continued. His reputation is not good. His absence today is a risk you've taken. Arthur opened his mouth to say something. That Mr. Doyle was the only lawyer willing to work for the fee he could afford. That he had been on the phone all night. That he hadn't had any choices at all. But the judge didn't give him a chance. The request for a postponement of the trial is denied. The gavel struck. Click. A small sound. But to Arthur, it sounded like an iron door slamming shut. The trial will continue. You represent yourself. Pro se. From the back row, a laugh escaped. Not loud, but clear enough. Arthur didn't turn around. He knew who was sitting there. The investors of Sterling Horizons. Several members of the City Planning Council. People who had been promised shares, seats, and contributions to the upcoming election campaign. They didn't need to whisper. They knew which side of the power they were on. The plaintiff, the judge said, turning to the table opposite. Mr. Pierce. Opening remarks. Gavin Pierce rose. He adjusted his lapel, his movements slow and confident. He didn't look at the judge. He turned toward the audience. Like a speaker stepping onto a stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Pierce began. His voice clear, round, and pleasant. We are here today for a very simple matter. He paused, letting the words linger in the air. Progress. Pierce stepped away from the table. One step at a time, his leather shoes tapping rhythmically on the wooden floor. He walked past Arthur, standing so close that Arthur could smell the expensive cologne mixed with the scent of cold coffee. Over the past 50 years, Pierce continued, Oak Haven has grown. We've become a proud commercial center of the area. He turned, pointing at Arthur without looking at him. But there's a tumor at the heart of that growth. Arthur felt the blood rush to his neck. The defendant, Mr. Bishop, occupies 20 acres of land at the highest point of the county. A strategic location. A location the city has deemed essential to the public interest. Pierce bent down, picking up a stack of photographs. And what do we have there? He tossed the first photograph onto the evidence table. A makeshift shack. The second, rustling vehicles. The third, fire hazard. Unsanitary. A stain. Then Pierce looked up, smiling sadly, as if he were. Morning, Arthur. But the worst thing, Your Honor, is that Mr. Bishop has no right to be there. Arthur jumped up. I am not a land grabber, he said, his voice trembling with indignation. My father bought that land. Objection, Pierce said flatly. The defendant's statement is out of order. Objection accepted. The judge responded immediately. Mr. Bishop, remain silent until your turn. Arthur sat down. His jaw clenched. Pierce smiled. Mr. Bishop believes he owns the land. Pierce continued. But what he calls a title deed is merely a relic. A piece of paper from the post-Civil War era, never properly registered. Pierce tilted his head. Legally, Your Honor, that land belongs to the state. Arthur looked at the empty chair beside him, and for the first time that day, he understood one thing clearly. Here, the law was not something to protect him. It was a weapon being used to crush him. Gavin Pierce paused in the middle of the courtroom, letting the photographs lie there. None of them asked what date the photos were taken. No one asked who had taken them. No one asked why none of them showed the entire estate. The images didn't need to be accurate. They just needed to be dirty enough. We're not here to insult Mr. Bishop, Pierce said, his voice soft and gentle. We just want to present the truth. Arthur bowed his head. He looked at his hands. Old scars etched on his skin, memories of the war years that no one in this room wanted to mention. Call the first witness, Pierce said. A thin man stepped up to the stand. His shirt was damp at the armpits. His hair was thinning, his gaze averted. Introducing Mr. Henderson, Pierce said, a county land surveyor. Henderson took the oath, his voice trembling. Mr. Henderson, Pierce began, walking slowly around the witness stand. You searched the records of ownership of the land known as Bishop's Ridge, didn't you? Yes, Henderson replied. I searched through all the archives. And what did you find? Henderson swallowed. He glanced at Preston Sterling, who was nodding slightly, as if to remind him. There is a record of a purchase of the land in 1919, Henderson said. But there are irregularities. Pierce paused. What kind of irregularities? The transfer tax was not fully paid according to the 1925 adjustment, Henderson said. And the boundary description is unclear. Arthur looked up. What does the description say? Pierce asked. Henderson cleared his throat. It says, from the stream to the sky. A few laughs erupted in the courtroom. Pierce turned to the judge, his arms outstretched. Your Honor, from the stream to the sky is not a legal description. It's folk poetry. Arthur jumped to his feet. We pay taxes every year, he said loudly. I have the receipts in my shoebox at home. Did you bring them today, Mr. Bishop? The judge asked, his voice cold. Arthur stood motionless. No, he hadn't brought 40 years of tax receipts. He didn't know he'd have to bring his whole life to prove his existence. Then, the judge said, flipping through the file, without sufficient tax evidence and with an invalid boundary description, Mr. Bishop has no legal standing. The gavel struck. Next witness. Pierce said immediately, giving Arthur no time to breathe. A woman stepped onto the platform. Her hair neatly tied back, glasses hanging on a wire, holding a file folder like a shield. Dr. Arlene Croft, Pierce introduced. Geriatric psychiatrist. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Dr. Croft, Pierce said, her voice low and sympathetic. You assessed Mr. Bishop's condition 2 months ago, didn't you? Yes, she replied, at the request of the city's social services. And your conclusion? Dr. Croft didn't look at Arthur. Mr. Bishop shows clear signs of cognitive decline, she said. He's agitated, paranoid, believes there are secret forces plotting to take his land. Arthur gasped. I'll only speak to you for 5 minutes, he exclaimed. You're asking me who the president is. Objection, Pierce interrupted. The defendant is speaking out of order again. Objection accepted, the judge said. Continue, Doctor. Mr. Bishop has a tendency to fabricate stories to compensate for his poverty, Croft continued. He lives in unsanitary conditions, hoarding what he calls historical documents, but in reality, hoarding. Pierce nodded slowly. So, in your professional opinion, he asked, is Mr. Bishop competent to manage a multi-million-dollar estate? Absolutely not, Croft answered without hesitation. He is a danger to himself. The courtroom murmured. Arthur felt his head spinning. Everything he had lived through was summed up in 2 words. Incompetent. Mr. Bishop, the judge said, you have the right to confront the witness. Arthur stood up. Each step toward the witness stand felt heavy as lead. He looked at Dr. Croft. You said I was paranoid. Arthur said slowly. You said I believed in secret protection. Did you request to see the papers I referred to? I don't need to rummage through your rubbish to make a diagnosis. She replied coldly. Arthur clenched his fists. Rubbish, he repeated. He turned to the judge. She called those things rubbish, Arthur said, his voice hardening. Because she decided I was a crazy old black man the moment I stepped onto my porch. Objection, Pierce shouted. The defendant is making a personal attack. The gavel struck. Mr. Bishop, the judge said sharply, you are overstepping your bounds. Again, and I will charge you with contempt of court. Arthur remained silent. He returned to his seat, and as he sat down, he felt it more clearly than ever. They didn't just want his land. They wanted to erase him from the story. Arthur Bishop sat down in the hard wooden chair, his back straight, but his shoulders heavy. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the opposing lawyer. He looked down at the floor. Whispers began to spread through the courtroom, no longer restrained. The murmurs piled up like a swarm of bees. He's crazy. What a waste of time. He should have been put in a nursing home a long time ago. A laugh erupted from the back row. Clearly, unconcealed. Arthur looked up. From the far end of the room, a young man in a polo shirt, sitting among Sterling's investors, leaned back and said loudly, "Come on, old man." Always playing the victim. The entire courtroom burst into laughter. Not just a few people, but the majority. Laughter echoed against the walls, the ceiling, and Arthur's own chest. It wasn't just mocking him. It was declaring, "We are stronger than you." The judge struck the gavel. "Silence," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only annoyance. "Mr. Bishop," the judge continued, "this court has no interest in historical grievances. We are dealing with current law, not the past. Arthur rose, slowly, as if every joint had to ask permission to move. Your Honor, he said, his voice hoarse but clear. The law says that a man's house is his castle. The judge sighed, glancing at his watch. Keep it brief, Mr. Bishop. Arthur looked directly at Preston Sterling. My father, Tobias Bishop, built that house with his own hands, Arthur said, after he returned from France in 1918. A wave of silence swept through the courtroom. Arthur continued, without stopping. He paid for that land with blood, Arthur said, and when he took the papers to the land registry office in 1920, they spat in his face and told him to go away. The air froze. Those words. No one wanted to hear them here. A laugh broke the silence. Louder. Cruffer. Oh my God. Again, someone shouted from behind. Always the victim. The laughter spread, louder than before. Arthur stood there, alone, amidst the wave of mockery. In that moment, he felt small. 82 years weighed on his shoulders. But then, he felt something else. A cold, heavy, familiar object was in his inner coat pocket. Arthur reached into his pocket. His calloused fingers touched the soft velvet fabric. The velvet pouch. A memory surfaced in his mind. His father's voice. Deep. Decisive. You don't need to say much, Arthur. When the time comes, let the truth speak for itself. Arthur closed his eyes for a second. The laughter was still there, but it began to sound farther away. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Bishop, he said, the court will move on to the evidence. I request your cooperation. I have a lunch appointment at 1 o'clock. Arthur opened his eyes. He withdrew his hand from his pocket. Not yet, but he knew one thing for sure. The laughter in this room would not last much longer. The trial continued as if everything had already been decided. Pierce's lawyer called for more witnesses. A few questions, a few nods. It all went quickly, neatly, coldly, like a pre-written verdict, waiting only for signature. Arthur sat there, silent. No one asked if he wanted to call witnesses. No one expected him to have anything to say. In their eyes, the story was over. Finally, Judge Thorne looked up, took off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a familiar gesture of someone about to finish their work. Mr. Bishop, the judge said impatiently, do you have anything to say before the court considers its verdict? The way he spoke wasn't an invitation. It was a formality, a nod to end it. Arthur stood up. This time, he stood straighter. His knees still ached. His back was still stiff. But something in his eyes had changed. Your Honor, Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't echo, but it forced the room into silence to listen. Lawyer Pierce glanced at his watch. A few people in the courtroom sighed. Arthur paused for a moment. Then he said a single sentence. If this court rules without seeing the evidence I have brought, then the court itself will be violating federal law. There was no laughter, no murmurs, only silence. A very different kind of silence. Judge Thorne immediately looked up. He leaned forward. What did you just say? The judge asked. Arthur didn't repeat himself. He looked directly at the judge. No bowing, no pleading. The evidence I brought, Arthur said slowly, is of federal jurisdiction, and it is above the jurisdiction of this county court. Lawyer Pierce burst out laughing. Your Honor, Pierce said, turning to the courtroom. We're back to the fantasy again. Federal, secret, conspiracy. Silence, the judge said. One word, but powerful enough to make Pierce stop mid-sentence. Arthur Bishop had just made a judge interrupt the most powerful lawyer in the room. That hadn't happened all morning. Mr. Bishop, the judge said, his voice now changed. Do you understand that presenting false federal evidence is a felony? I understand, Arthur replied. Immediately. And I also understand that ignoring a valid federal document is unconstitutional. A few people in the courtroom began to sit up straight. That statement wasn't from a senile old man. It was too accurate, too clear. The judge was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, you have 5 minutes. The courtroom buzzed. 5 minutes to present the evidence you just mentioned. If what you bring is just an old letter, a worthless copy, or... The judge paused, his gaze cold. Then I will immediately charge you with contempt of court. Arthur nodded. That's enough, he said. He walked to the center of the courtroom. All eyes followed him. There was no more laughter. Only curiosity mixed with anxiety. Arthur reached into his inner coat pocket. This time, he didn't take his hand out. He pulled out a small purple velvet pouch. Small, old, but it was carefully guarded like a sacred object. A young man in the back seat whispered, loud enough for those around him to hear. What does he have in there? Poison? Or his imagination? No one laughed. Arthur walked to the court clerk's desk. Step by step, slowly, surely, he untied the bag. And in that moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Because even though no one knew what he was about to take out, everyone sensed that this trial had just taken a completely different turn. Arthur Bishop stood before the court clerk's desk. A purple velvet pouch rested neatly in his hand. The courtroom was silent. No one coughed. No one moved a chair. Even the policeman standing near the door stopped leaning against the wall. Arthur untied the string. Slowly, carefully, as if he were opening something that belonged not only to him, but to history. Then he tilted the pouch. Two objects slid out, touching the wooden surface with very different sounds. The first fell softly, like paper touching a table. The second fell, heavily, making a dry clank, startling several people. A trifold document, yellowed with age, encased in hard plastic. And a medal, not the kind of medal one sees in modern ceremonies. This medal is older, heavier. The dark bronze surface bears the patina of time, something no antique forger could create in weeks. A five-pointed star, surrounded by a green laurel wreath. A pale blue ribbon, dotted with white stars. The Medal of Honor. No one spoke. Arthur broke the silence. This medal, he said, his voice echoing in the room devoid of laughter, belongs to my father. He pointed to the bronze star. Sergeant Tobias Bishop, 369th Regiment. Harlem Hellfighters. Several in the audience changed expression. That name, not everyone knew it, but those who did, knew it very well. Arthur turned his hand to the remaining document. And this, he said, is not a land use certificate. He looked up, meeting Judge Thorne's gaze. This is a land patent. A murmur spread. A land patent. Not a deed. Not a local contract. Judge Thorne straightened his back. Arthur continued, word by word, clearly as if reading in order. It was signed by the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, co-signed by the Secretary of War, and given to my father as a reward for service for which this nation never adequately repaid. Arthur placed his hand on the document. It grants my family 20 acres of land on Bishop's Ridge, forever, exempt from local taxes, exempt from expropriation, and not subject to requisition laws, unless by direct congressional act. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The judge said nothing. He was looking at the signature at the bottom of the document. Bold ink. Confirmed. Unwavering. Woodrow Wilson. The judge reached out, then stopped midair. He didn't dare touch it. Your Honor. Gavin Pierce sprang up, his voice more urgent than before. This is clearly a forgery. Documents like this. Silence, the judge said. No gavel. Just words. Pierce was speechless. Arthur remained standing. No folded arms. No triumphant expression. He added only one more sentence. Therefore, Your Honor, unless the plaintiffs have a congressional act in their pocket, then today, they are the ones trespassing on federal land. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then, the truth began to sink in. Preston Sterling was no longer leaning back. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the bronze star on the table. Sterling understood metal. He understood antiques. And he knew very well. It was real. The judge cleared his throat. Judicial police, he said, his voice higher than usual. Seal the evidence. Arthur watched the metal being placed in the evidence box. For a very brief moment, he felt a sense of loss. But then he remembered his father's words. The truth doesn't need you to hold it. It knows how to stand on its own. The judge struck the gavel. The trial adjourned for 1 hour. The gavel struck loudly, not to end it, but to prevent an earthquake that had just begun. The gavel had barely finished striking when the courtroom erupted into a sea of noise. No more laughter, no more leisure, only hurried whispers, shifting chairs, and eyes darting frantically toward the evidence table, where the medals and documents had just been removed. Preston Sterling sprang from his chair. For the first time that day, he couldn't control his expression. Gavin, Sterling whispered, his grip tightening on the lawyer's arm. This can't be happening. Gavin Pierce didn't answer immediately. He was looking toward the courtroom door, where the judicial police had just left with the evidence box. Pierce's gaze was no longer sharp. It was calculating. On the other side, Arthur Bishop remained seated at the defendant's table. He didn't stand up. He didn't celebrate. He didn't look after him. He simply placed his hands on his thighs, closing his eyes for a few seconds. The adrenaline surge subsided quickly, leaving behind a familiar feeling of exhaustion. His knees ached. His back was stiff. But deep inside, something had changed. For the first time in years, he no longer felt small. Mr. Bishop. Arthur opened his eyes. A young woman stood at the barrier between the courtroom and the courtroom. She wore a simple blouse, holding a notebook and pen. "I'm Sarah Jenkins," she said softly, "a reporter for the Oak Haven Gazette." Arthur looked at her for a second. There was no morbid curiosity in her eyes, no sarcastic smile, only genuine concern. "What you said about your father," Sarah continued, her voice softer. "Is that true?" Arthur nodded. "He served in the 369th Regiment," Arthur said. 21 consecutive days in the trenches. Not an inch lost. Not a single man captured. Sarah took notes so quickly her hands trembled. "So, why did the president give him the land?" she asked. Arthur exhaled slowly. "Because when my father returned," he said, "this town didn't want him here." Arthur gazed into the distance, as if looking through the walls of the courthouse. "They burned down the homes of people like us in the summer of 1919, he continued. "My father wrote to his former commander, Colonel Haywood." "And what did he do?" Sarah asked. "He walked straight into the White House," Arthur said. "Tell President Wilson, if my best sergeant cannot live peacefully in this country, then the entire regiment will go to Georgia to ensure it." Sarah paused. "And the president," she whispered, "didn't want a racial war," Arthur said. "So he signed the land patent. A gift, and also a way to make the problem disappear." In the distance, Gavin Pierce turned and saw Sarah talking to Arthur. His face darkened. "No interview," Pierce snapped, striding quickly toward them. "This case is still ongoing." Sarah took a step back, but her eyes never left Arthur. "All right," she said softly. "Whatever." Pierce turned his back, but Arthur could clearly hear him grinding his teeth. In the hallway outside, Judge Thorne stood alone. He held the phone, his voice low and urgent. "Yes," Thorne said. "Check the metal serial number." Immediately. A pause. "No," he continued. "I don't care what it causes. If the document is real, then we're standing on federal soil." He hung up. In the hallway mirror, Thorne saw himself. Not a powerful judge, but a man who had just realized that there are boundaries that money and connections cannot cross. In the courtroom, Arthur Bishop opened his eyes and looked toward the door. He knew this wasn't over. When the strong are cornered, they won't let go. And if he was right, the next blow wouldn't be on paper anymore. An hour dragged on so slowly it felt as if time had stopped. The courtroom, once so noisy, now held a completely different atmosphere. The laughter of the morning had vanished. In its place were faces filled with curiosity, tension, and apprehension. The judge's door swung open. Judge Lawrence Thorne emerged. No longer the initial composure. No longer the weary look in his eyes. He held a thin sheet of paper in his hand, but it felt as heavy as lead. "The trial continues," the judge said, his voice low. Everyone rose, then sat down. Arthur Bishop gripped the armrest of his chair. His heart beat steadily, slowly. He had lived long enough to know. Good news rarely comes alone. The judge looked down at the file. "We have received a response from the U.S. Department of Defense," he said. "The Medal of Honor number presented is authentic." A gasp escaped from somewhere in the room. Arthur closed his eyes. "They know, Father." The judge continued. "This medal was awarded to Sergeant Tobias Bishop on March 15, 1919. He paused. "Then read on. And land patent number 77A, signed by President Woodrow Wilson, is now held at the National Archives." All eyes turned to Arthur. "This document," the judge said, "grants perpetual ownership of 20 acres known as Bishop's Ridge to Tobias Bishop and his legal heirs." Arthur opened his eyes. A very faint smile flickered across his lips. "Just for a moment, Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice firmer. "Then this case. It's not over." A voice interrupted. Gavin Pierce stood up abruptly. Not panicked, not angry. He was smiling. A new smile. Sharper. More dangerous. We are no longer arguing about the authenticity of the document, Pierce said. We are arguing about the standing of the person standing before us to inherit it. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed instantly. Arthur felt his stomach tighten. Pierce stepped to the center of the room. The land patent clearly states, he continued, the land is granted to Tobias Bishop and his legal heirs. Pierce emphasized each word. Your Honor, during our review of the civil registry, we found no marriage certificate for Tobias Bishop. Arthur shook his head. My parents were married in church, he said. The records were burned. Right? Pierce nodded. The church burned down in 1950, but the county records weren't. Pierce placed a stack of papers on the judge's desk. Arthur Bishop's birth certificate, 1943, Pierce said. The father's name section is blank. Arthur stood up. That's a lie, he said. They didn't name my father because... Mr. Bishop, the judge interrupted. Let the lawyer present his case. Pierce turned toward the courtroom. According to the law of 1919, he said, legal heir only applies to children born within marriage or legally adopted. Pierce spread his hands, as if in regret. Without a marriage certificate, he continued, Arthur Bishop is not the rightful heir. A murmur arose. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. They had found a way. They had used the very records erased due to racial discrimination to win. The judge looked at Arthur. Mr. Bishop, he said slowly, do you have legal proof that your parents were married? Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it. He thought of the burnt-out wooden church. He thought of the papers that were never issued. He thought of an entire generation recorded as non-existent. No, Arthur whispered. Preston Sterling leaned back in his chair. This time, he didn't hide his smile. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. The court gives Mr. Bishop until 9 a.m. tomorrow, he said, to provide proof of legal marriage or adoption. Without proof, he paused. The court will be forced to rule in favor of the plaintiff. The gavel struck. The trial is adjourned. Arthur stood still. Everything had just been recognized. And immediately, twisted, a century later, the very injustice that had caused his father to need that land patent was now being used to take it away from him. As Arthur turned toward the door, he heard laughter. Behind him, not loud, but familiar enough. And this time, it was more dangerous than ever. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Arthur Bishop with a heavy thud. It sounded like a coffin lid closing. The midday sun shone on the cold stone steps of the Oak Haven County Courthouse, but Arthur felt no warmth. He stood there, his grip on his old wooden cane, his shoulders slumped as if he had aged 10 years in a single minute. All he had, his father's medal, his land patent, and then, in just one sentence from his opponent's lawyer, it all seemed insufficient. Arthur took a deep breath. That's it, he murmured, as if to himself. Without the papers, they win. Not necessarily. Arthur turned around. Sarah Jenkins stood on the edge of the steps, phone in hand. Her eyes glued to the screen as if searching for something among thousands of old lines of text. I just thought of something, she said quickly, breathless. You said your father served in the 369th Regiment, right? Arthur nodded. And he was a sergeant? Yes. Sarah swallowed hard, then looked up. In wartime, commanding officers often signed off on wedding ceremonies for soldiers. When they were getting married quickly before or after going into battle, she said, especially during World War I. Arthur frowned. My father once mentioned someone, he said slowly. A white officer who treated him like a brother. Sarah typed quickly on her phone. I'm looking through the press archives, she said. Things the court would never look at. Then she stopped. Completely. Oh my God, Sarah whispered. What is it? Arthur asked. Sarah turned the screen toward him. An old news bulletin, dated 1922. Obituary. Lieutenant Thomas Maxwell. Sarah read. United States Army officer. Died at age 31 from complications of war wounds. Arthur stared intently. Read on, he said. Sarah took a breath. In his will, she read slowly. I entrust my eternal gratitude to Sergeant Tobias Bishop, who carried me 2 miles through the Argonne forest when I was wounded. I leave the entire contents of my safe at the First National Bank of Atlanta, held in trust until he or his heirs come to claim them. Arthur felt his heart pound. The safe, he repeated. My father never mentioned it. He might not know, Sarah said. Quickly. Or he might know. but never thought it would be necessary. Arthur looked up at the dull gray sky. If there's a letter in there, he said, or a photo, or anything that proves my parents were married, then you win, Sarah said, her eyes brightening. Absolutely. Arthur looked at his watch. 1:32 p.m. The court gave me until 9 a.m. tomorrow, he said. Less than 20 hours. Sarah clutched her car keys. That bank no longer exists, she said. It was merged. But the safes weren't destroyed. They were transferred to the state's unclaimed property department. Arthur looked at her. In the capital? Sarah nodded. 2 hours drive from here. If we make it before closing time. Arthur didn't hesitate. Let's go, he said. They had just walked toward the parking lot when Arthur suddenly stopped. He turned to look back at the courthouse. Under the shadow of a large stone pillar, Gavin Pierce was standing there, looking at them. No smile. No words. Just a look. Then he pulled out his phone. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah, he whispered as they got into the car. We're not just racing. Against time. Sarah started the Honda Civic. I guess so, she said, her eyes fixed straight ahead. But I drive fast. The car pulled out of the parking lot. Arthur looked in the rearview mirror. A black SUV had also just started and was following them. The 12-hour race had begun. The Honda Civic blended into the stream of cars pouring out of Oak Haven. The sky began to darken. Heavy clouds hung low overhead, foreshadowing something ominous. Arthur said nothing. He stared in the rearview mirror. What are you looking at? Sarah asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The black SUV, Arthur replied softly. It's been there since we left the courthouse. Sarah glanced quickly. The SUV blended into the traffic, but the distance hadn't changed. It could just be a coincidence, she said, her voice uncertain. Arthur shook his head slowly. In wartime, he said, coincidences are rare. They were on the federal highway. It began to rain. At first a drizzle, then quickly turned into a heavy southern downpour, blurring the contours of the world. The red taillights stretched like a stream of blood. The black SUV closed in. It changed lanes as they changed, accelerated as they accelerated. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel. You're right, she whispered. They're following us. Arthur leaned forward. Don't look back, he said. Watch the road and listen to me. The SUV accelerated, swerving to the left. The window rolled down. A man with a thick neck, wearing sunglasses despite the rain, poked his head out and gestured for them to pull over. Don't, Arthur said firmly. Don't stop. The SUV slammed into the side of their car. Crash. Sarah screamed. The Civic swerved, its wheels skidding on the wet pavement. He's hitting us, she cried out in alarm. Keep the steering wheel straight. Arthur yelled. Slam the brakes. Sarah slammed on the brakes. The Civic skidded. The SUV, unexpectedly, surged forward. Exit. Arthur pointed. To the right. Sarah swerved sharply. They sped down the side road, leaving the highway behind in a blinding downpour. The SUV couldn't keep up. Sarah pulled over to an abandoned gas station by the roadside. She turned off the engine, slumped her head onto the steering wheel, and gasped for breath. I'm just a reporter, she stammered. I write about the fall fair. I don't. Arthur placed his hand on her shoulder. His hand trembled slightly, but firmly. Courage isn't about not being afraid, he said slowly. Courage is doing what needs to be done, even when your legs are shaking. Sarah looked up. In her eyes, fear began to give way to anger. They dented my car, she said. I have 12 installments left. Arthur chuckled hoarsely. If we find what we're looking for, he said, Mr. Sterling will buy you the whole dealership. Sarah took a deep breath and restarted the engine. They left the highway, turning onto winding country roads to avoid being followed. The price was time. When the high-rise buildings of the state capitol came into view in the distance. The clock showed 4:48 p.m. We're going to be late, Sarah said. Arthur looked straight ahead. Not late, he replied. We haven't even had a breath yet. They sped into the parking lot of the gray concrete building, the state unclaimed property office. Sarah jumped out of the car and ran ahead. Arthur followed, each step aching. The glass door was locked. We need to get in, Sarah cried. The guard shook his head. Time's up. Arthur stepped forward. He looked at the badge on the guard's uniform. An eagle, a globe, an anchor. Marine Corps. Arthur asked. The guard looked up. Vietnam? He asked again. 1968, Arthur replied. Dunno. A moment of silence. Then the guard stepped aside. 10 minutes. He said. Brenda's desk. Basement. The door opened. Arthur stepped inside, his heart pounding. He didn't know that. The greatest danger was yet to come. The old elevator rattled as it descended to the basement. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed like the sigh of an aging building. Arthur leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a second. The joint pain intensified as the adrenaline wore off. Are you all right? Sarah asked. I've been worse, Arthur replied, his voice hoarse but calm. In the jungle. I didn't even know if I'd make it to morning. The elevator doors opened. The smell of old paper dust, rusty metal, and the indifference of decades poured in. Behind the counter was Brenda, a middle-aged woman with sharp, piercing eyes, carrying a bag, ready to leave. I said it was closing time, she snapped without looking up. We only need one file, Sarah said quickly, holding up her press card. A safe from 1922. Involves a military officer. Brenda stopped. 1922, she repeated. Those things are in a special storage. They can't be traced. Arthur stepped forward. Madam, he said slowly. That is the only evidence I have to keep the house where my father lived and died. Brenda looked at him, not at a nuisance, but at a familiar story. She glanced at her watch. 4:55. Follow me, she said. The steel door behind the counter opened. Inside were tall, ceiling-high shelves filled with dusty boxes. Things that had once meant something to someone, then been swallowed by time. Maxwell, Brenda murmured, flipping through the thick register. She paused. Box 402, she said. Transferred from First National Bank in 1955. Never received. She pulled down a small, lead-sealed metal box. If it doesn't contain what you need, Brenda said, then I've broken the law in vain. Arthur didn't reply. His hands trembled. As the box's lid was opened, inside were three things. A gold pocket watch, a bundle of letters tied with old string, and a military leather-bound Bible. Arthur picked up the Bible. On the very first page, handwriting appeared, neat, careful, presented to Sergeant Tobias Bishop and Sarah Mae Johnson on their wedding anniversary, March 20th, 1919. Witness, Lieutenant Thomas Maxwell. Below was a sepia photograph. His father, his mother, and a white officer standing in the middle, smiling. Arthur made a strange sound. Half a laugh, half a sob. He kept it. Arthur whispered. He knew no one else would keep it. Sarah had been taking pictures and videos, her hands trembling with emotion. That's enough, she said. Enough to win. Undeniably. Arthur closed the Bible, pressing it tightly against his chest. We have to go now, he said. They thanked Brenda, who now only nodded slightly. The underground parking lot was silent. Fluorescent lights flickered. Give me the keys. A voice emerged from the darkness. A man with a thick neck stepped out, holding an iron bar. Mr. Sterling doesn't want you taking that out of. Here, he said. Give it to me, or this girl won't be able to drive anymore. Arthur stepped forward, shielding him from Sarah. Don't, Sarah whispered. Arthur didn't look back. Son, he said to the man, his voice low and cold. You just threatened my unit. Arthur tossed the empty box aside. The man instinctively turned his head. In that moment, Arthur Bishop was no longer an 82-year-old man. He spun around, gathered his strength, and swung his wooden stick. Crack. The man's wrist snapped. The iron bar fell to the floor. Arthur continued, a clean shove to the chest. Right there. The thug doubled over, gasping for breath. Get in the car, Arthur yelled. Sarah didn't ask. The Civic sped out of the parking lot. Arthur clutched his Bible. Remind me never to anger you, Sarah gasped. Arthur looked out the window. War, he said, never leaves us. In the distance, the yellow lights of Bishop's Ridge had begun to come on. And Arthur understood something terrifying. They weren't waiting for court anymore. It wasn't quite daylight when they turned onto the dirt road leading up to Bishop's Ridge. Early morning mist hung low over the pine trees. The silence was unusual. Then Arthur saw light. Not the sunrise, but the headlights of a construction site. 3 yellow bulldozers stood tall in front of the wooden fence. Their engines roared, spewing white smoke into the cold morning air. Arthur felt his heart sink. They arrived before sunrise, he said. Sarah slammed on the brakes. Mr. Sterling, she whispered. Preston Sterling was standing by the gate, his long coat draped loosely over his shoulder, holding his phone, constantly checking his watch. He wasn't waiting for a verdict. He was erasing evidence. If they demolish the house before 9 o'clock, Arthur said, his voice icy, they'll pay the fine and say it was a mistake. Sarah pulled out her phone. I'm live streaming, she said. Right now. Arthur opened the car door. What are you doing? Sarah exclaimed in alarm. Arthur held a stick in one hand and clutched a Bible in the other. I'm going home, he said. Sterling saw him. Do it now. Sterling yelled at the bulldozer driver. Smooth it out. The bulldozer in front roared. The steel blade lifted. Arthur stepped into the mud. He didn't run. He didn't dodge. He walked straight to the blade, plunging the stick into the ground. Thump. If you want this land, Arthur roared amidst the engine noise. You'll have to get past the soldier first. Sarah yelled from behind him. Thousands of people were watching the live stream. The bulldozer slowed down. The driver looked down at Arthur. An old black man, trembling, but not backing down. I won't do it. The worker yelled, turning off the machine. I don't kill veterans for money. Sterling reeled, screaming. But it was too late. Flashing red and green lights crisscrossed the trees. Police. Then a federal vehicle. Sterling took a step back. We can talk, he stammered. Handcuff him. A voice called out. Handcuffs snapped shut on Preston Sterling's wrists. Arthur stood still, leaning on his cane. The house remained behind him. That morning, the courtroom was packed. There wasn't a seat. Judge Thorne entered, his face stern. Arthur placed the Bible on the judge's table. Without a word, the judge opened it. He looked at the words. He looked at the picture. Then he looked up. This evidence, he said, his voice firm, is irrefutable. Lawyer Pierce jumped to his feet, drenched in sweat. Objection. Dismissed. The judge interrupted. And there's another issue. He held up the tablet. Intentional destruction of federal property. Threatening the lives of citizens. Violation of a court stay. He looked directly at Sterling. This case is permanently dismissed. Arthur Bishop is the rightful owner of Bishop's Ridge. Arthur closed his eyes. A long sigh. Not relief, but completion. Sterling was led away. The business collapsed. The project was canceled. Bishop's Ridge was subsequently recognized as a historic site. Arthur Bishop lived out his remaining years on the porch of his father's house, watching the sun set behind the pine trees, knowing that his family's history had finally been restored. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from those in power. It comes from a man who was ridiculed, dared to speak a word, and didn't back down.